Chapter 1. The Arrival. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Blackshore, carrying with it the salty tang of the sea and the faint scent of decay. Lisa Monroe tightened her scarf around her neck as she stepped off the creaking bus, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape before her. The town was a stark contrast to the vibrant city she had left behind. Its weathered buildings leaned precariously, their paint peeling like old skin. The sky hung low, a heavy gray blanket that seemed to press down on everything beneath it. Lisa adjusted the strap of her backpack, her fingers brushing against the camera nestled inside. She had come here for a story that could catapult her YouTube channel into the limelight. The Blackshore miracle had been trending for weeks, and she was determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances and the weight loss phenomenon that had baffled scientists and conspiracy theorists alike. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she made her way toward the town square. The streets were eerily empty, save for a stray cat that darted across her path, its fur matted and its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the black rocks that gave the town its name. The town square was a small, cobblestone-paved area dominated by a weathered statue of a fisherman. His face was worn smooth by time, his eyes staring out toward the sea as if searching for something or someone lost to the waves. Surrounding the square were a few struggling businesses, a general store with a flickering neon sign, a pub called the Drunken Sailor, and a small tourist center that looked as though it had seen better days. Lisa approached the tourist center, her breath visible in the cold air. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The walls were lined with faded posters advertising the town's spooky past and the infamous Miracle Fishing Tour. A young woman with tired eyes sat behind the counter, her fingers tapping idly on the surface of an old computer. "Hi," Lisa said, forcing a bright smile. "I'm here for the fishing tour." The woman looked up, her expression guarded. "You sure about that? Most folks come for the ghost stories, not the fishing." Lisa's smile faltered. "I'm here for both, actually. I'm a journalist, well, sort of. I run a YouTube channel and I'm looking into the Blackshore miracle." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. Well, the tour leaves at dawn tomorrow. You'll need to sign a waiver." "Of course," Lisa said, pulling out her phone to record. "Can you tell me more about the miracle? What exactly happens?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the back room. "It's hard to explain. Some people come back different, thinner. They don't remember much about the trip. Others don't come back at all." Lisa's heart quickened. This was exactly the kind of mystery she had been hoping for. "What do you mean, they don't come back? Do they go missing?" The woman's lips tightened into a thin line. "Look, I'm just here to book the tour. If you want answers, you'll have to talk to the fishermen. But I warn you, they don't take kindly to outsiders poking around." Lisa thanked the woman and stepped back out into the cold. Her mind raced with possibilities. She needed to find someone who would talk, someone who could give her the inside scoop. Her gaze landed on the pub across the square, its warm light spilling out onto the cobblestones. The Drunken Sailor was everything Lisa had expected and more. The air was thick with the smell of beer and cigarette smoke, the walls adorned with old nautical instruments and faded photographs of ships that had never returned. The patrons, mostly fishermen, sat in small groups, their voices low and their eyes wary. Lisa approached the bar, where a gruff-looking man with a bushy beard was polishing glasses. "What'll it be?" he asked, not bothering to look up. "Just a soda, please," Lisa said, sliding onto a stool. "I'm new in town." The man grunted and set a glass in front of her. "Tourist." "Journalist," Lisa replied, hoping the title would carry more weight. "I'm here to investigate the Blackshore miracle." The man's eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of fear. "You should stick to the ghost stories, the miracle. It's not something you want to mess with." Lisa leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Why not? What's really going on here?" The man glanced around the room, his expression uneasy. "Some things are best left alone. The sea, it takes and gives as it will. You start asking too many questions, you might not like the answers." Lisa opened her mouth to press further, but a hand clamped down on her shoulder, making her jump. She turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing blue eyes and a scowl that could melt steel. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Ede," his voice a low growl. "Lisa Monroe," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here too." "I know why you're here," he interrupted. "And I'm telling you right now, you're not welcome. This town doesn't need any more trouble." Lisa felt a surge of defiance. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand what's happening." The man's grip tightened, and for a moment she thought he might throw her out. But then he released her with a muttered curse. "You want to understand? Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked away, leaving Lisa shaken but determined. She had come too far to back down now. She needed to dig deeper, no matter the cost. The fog rolled in as Lisa walked back to the town square, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that seeped into your bones and made you feel as though you were drowning. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, the world reduced to a gray, shapeless void. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. And then she saw it. A ship emerged from the fog, its sails tattered and its hull dark as night. It moved silently, gliding across the water with an otherworldly grace. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing, the ghost ship from the legends. She fumbled for her camera, her fingers trembling as she tried to focus. But as quickly as it had appeared, the ship vanished, swallowed by the fog once more. The whale faded into the night, leaving her standing there, frozen in place. Her hands were shaking as she lowered the camera, her mind racing. She had come here for a story, but now she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth. The words of the fisherman echoed in her mind. Some come back, some don't. And as she stood there, surrounded by the impenetrable fog, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to become part of the legend herself. Chapter 2, The First Clues. The morning fog rolled in thick and heavy, cloaking Blackshore in an eerie silence. The sea, restless and dark, lapped against the jagged black rocks that gave the town its name. Lisa Monroe stood at the edge of the harbor, the salty breeze tugging at her hair and the chills seeping into her bones. The air smelled of seaweed and something faintly metallic, a scent that made the back of her throat itch. She adjusted the strap of her camera bag, feeling the weight of her equipment and the anticipation of what lay ahead. The harbor was a ghostly scene, the weathered fishing boats bobbing gently in the water, their masts disappearing into the mist. A few fishermen moved about in the dim light, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. Lisa watched as one of them, a tall man with a battered leather jacket, cast a wary glance in her direction before turning back to his work. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were all watching her, their eyes following her every move. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the creaking wooden planks of the dock, her boots echoing in the stillness. The town felt alien, like a place forgotten by time, and she couldn't help but feel like an intruder. But she wasn't here to blend in. She was here to uncover the truth, to find out what happened to those who disappeared, to capture the mystery of Blackshore and make it her own. Her first stop was the Drunken Sailor, the only pub in town. It was said to be the heart of Blackshore, where the locals gathered after a long day at sea. If she wanted to learn anything about the disappearances, that was where she needed to start. The Drunken Sailor was exactly as she had imagined it, dimly lit, with a haze of cigarette smoke hanging in the air. The walls were adorned with old nautical instruments and faded photographs of ships that never returned. The bar itself was rough-hewn wood, scarred by years of use, and behind it stood a burly bartender with a face like a storm cloud. Lisa hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of the patrons' stares. She raised her chin and walked in, trying to appear confident. The jukebox in the corner played a mournful sea shanty, the melody adding to the oppressive atmosphere. She approached the bar and slid onto a stool, her camera bag resting on the floor beside her. The bartender gave her a once-over, his eyes lingering on her equipment. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. "Just a coffee, please," Lisa replied, forcing a smile. The man grunted and turned to the coffee machine, his movements slow and deliberate. Lisa glanced around the room, her eyes falling on a group of fishermen seated at a corner table. They were huddled together, their voices low and their expressions tense. She caught fragments of their conversation, missed, disappeared, the sea, and her curiosity piqued. The bartender set a mug of coffee in front of her, the steam rising in lazy curls. "You're not from around here," he stated, his tone more of an accusation than a question. "No," Lisa admitted. "I'm visiting. I'm a writer." She decided to leave out the part about being a YouTuber. Something told her that wouldn't go over well. The man's eyes narrowed. "Be careful what you write about. We don't take kindly to outsiders poking their noses where they don't belong." Lisa swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She took a sip of the coffee, the bitter taste grounding her. The fishermen at the corner table stood up, their chairs scraping against the wooden floor. They cast her one last, lingering glance before heading for the door, their boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. Lisa watched them go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The tourist center was a stark contrast to the drunken sailor, its cheerful facade almost laughable in the grim atmosphere of Blackshore. The building was small and unassuming, with a sign out front that read, "Welcome to Blackshore, land of mystery and miracle." Lisa pushed the door open, a bell jingling softly above her head. The interior was bright and cheerful, with posters advertising the town's attractions plastered on the walls. A young woman with a forced smile stood behind the counter, her eyes a little too wide, a little too bright. "Welcome to Blackshore," she chirped, her voice unnervingly upbeat. "How can I help you today?" Lisa approached the counter, glancing around the room. "I'm interested in the Miracle Fishing Tour. Can you tell me more about them?" The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning full force. "Of course. Our famous fishing tour are a once-in-a-lifetime experience. We take you out on the sea, and who knows, you might just come back with a little less weight and a lot more mystery." She laughed, a sound that grated on Lisa's nerves. "How does it work?" Lisa pressed, keeping her tone light. "Oh, it's all quite simple," the woman replied, her voice too sweet. "You book a tour, we take you out, and nature does the rest. Some people experience the miracle, some don't. It's all up to the sea." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Has anyone ever disappeared on these tours? The woman's smile froze, and for a moment she looked almost panicked. "Now, why would you ask something like that?" she asked, her voice strained. "Just curious," Lisa said, keeping her tone casual. "I've heard some rumors, that's all." The woman's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape. "Our tour are perfectly safe," she said finally, her voice tight. "Now, is there anything else I can help you with?" Lisa shook her head, sensing that she wouldn't get any more information. "No, that's all, thank you." She turned and left the center, the bell jingling behind her. The air outside felt heavier, the fog pressing in on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the town itself was alive, watching her every move. That evening, Lisa sat in her rented room, her laptop open in front of her. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked the harbor. The fog had rolled in even thicker, obscuring the view of the sea. She scrolled through the footage she had taken that day, her mind racing. The fishermen's guarded expressions, the bartender's warning, the tourist center workers' panic, it all pointed to something deeply wrong in Blackshore. But what? Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up, her heart skipping a beat. It was an anonymous message, just one line. "Some come back, some don't. Do you really want to know why?" Lisa stared at the message, her fingers trembling. She didn't know who had sent it or how they had gotten her number. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to stop until she found out the truth. The fog outside seemed to close in, the world beyond the window growing darker and more obscure. Lisa felt a shiver run down her spine, a premonition of something terrible to come. She set the phone down and closed her laptop, the room falling into silence. But the message lingered in her mind, a question she couldn't shake. Do you really want to know why? Chapter 3. The Weight of Shadows. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, wrapping Blackshore in a suffocating embrace. Lisa Monroe tightened her jacket against the damp chill as she walked the cobblestone streets, the sound of her boots echoing eerily in the dense mist. The town seemed different now, as though the fog had stripped away its veneer of normalcy, revealing something darker, more primal. The air smelled of salt and decay, and the distant cry of a gull sounded more like a lament than a bird call. Lisa's breath came in shallow puffs as she approached the drunken Salo. Our pub, the dim light from its windows barely piercing the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and tobacco. The old jukebox in the corner played a haunting sea shanty, its mournful melody blending with the low murmur of voices. Fishermen sat hunched over their drinks, their faces etched with weariness and suspicion. Lisa could feel their eyes on her as she made her way to the bar, the weight of their stares heavy on her back. The bartender, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, gave her a curt nod as she approached. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice rough like sandpaper. "Just a coffee," Lisa replied, forcing a smile. She needed to stay sharp, needed to keep her wits about her. The bartender grunted and turned to pour the drink, his movements slow and deliberate. Lisa took the coffee and found a corner table, her eyes scanning the room. She needed information, needed to uncover the secrets of Blackshore. Her gaze fell on Caleb Hargrove, the oldest fisherman in town, sitting alone at a table in the shadowed corner. His weathered face was creased with deep lines, his eyes clouded with memories she could only guess at. He appeared to be lost in thought, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug of something dark and steaming. The Drunken Sailor pub felt like a living entity, its low ceiling and dim lighting creating an oppressive atmosphere. The walls, adorned with old nautical instruments and faded photographs of ships lost at sea, seemed to close in on her. The jukebox's mournful melody had shifted to a new tune, this one even more haunting than the last. The Fishermen's Corner, a secluded table in the back, was where Lisa's gaze kept returning. The men sitting there spoke in low tones, their voices barely audible over the music. Their eyes were sharp, their expressions guarded. They were the ones who knew something, she was sure of it. Lisa took a sip of her coffee, the bitter liquid scalding her tongue. She needed to approach them, needed to find a way into their circle. But how? They clearly didn't trust outsiders, and her presence was already drawing too much attention. She glanced around, her mind racing. The bartender was watching her, his eyes narrowed. She forced herself to look away, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're not from around here," a voice said, startling her. She turned to see a man standing beside her table. He was younger than the others, his red hair a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. His face was friendly enough, but there was a nervous energy about him, a tension that made her uneasy. "I'm Lisa," she said, forcing another smile. "I'm staying at the inn." "Tommy Fallon," he replied, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his skin rough from years of handling fishing nets. "You're the one asking questions, aren't you?" Lisa nodded, her pulse quickening. "I'm just trying to understand the town, the history, the legends, it's fascinating." Tommy's eyes darted to the Fishermen's Corner, then back to her. "Be careful," he said, his voice low. "Some things are better left alone." "Why?" Lisa asked, leaning forward. "What's going on here? Why do people disappear?" Tommy's jaw tightened, and he glanced over his shoulder again. "You're playing with fire," he said. "If you know what's good for you, you'll leave it alone." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Lisa watched him go, her mind racing. What was he so afraid of? What were they all afraid of? The night wore on, the pub growing quieter as the fishermen drifted out one by one. Lisa stayed, nursing her coffee and watching, waiting. She needed more, needed to push harder. Her mind kept returning to Caleb Hargrove, sitting alone in the corner. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. She took a deep breath and made her way over to his table. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up, his eyes piercing despite their cloudiness. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I want to understand," she said. "About the disappearances, about the sea." Hargrove's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment she felt as though he could see straight through her. "You don't want to understand," he said. "You think you do, but you don't." "Please," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "People are disappearing. I need to know why." Hargrove shook his head slowly. "Some come back," he said. "Some don't. The sea takes and gives as it will." Lisa's heart pounded. "But why? What's out there?" Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, "whether you want to or not." Before she could press further, he stood and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty pub. Lisa stared after him, a cold chill running down her spine. What had he meant by that? What was he trying to warn her about? She glanced around the empty pub, the dim light cast long shadows across the room. The jukebox had gone silent, the only sound the ticking of an old clock on the wall. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease, as though the walls were closing in on her. She needed to get out, needed to breathe. Lisa stood and hurried to the door, stepping out into the cold, damp night. The fog was thicker now, swallowing the town in a suffocating embrace. She pulled her jacket tighter and started walking, her footsteps echoing in the empty street. The town felt different at night, more sinister, more alive. She could feel the weight of its secrets pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. As she turned the corner, she caught a glimpse of something in the fog, a figure standing at the edge of the harbor. It was too dark to make out any details, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold and unblinking. Her heart pounded, and she froze, unable to move. The figure didn't move either, just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the fog. Lisa stared at the spot where it had been, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What the hell had that been? Her mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she couldn't. She was in too deep now, too close to the truth. She took a deep breath and forced herself to keep walking, her steps quickening as she made her way back to the inn. The town was silent, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the rocks. She could feel the weight of the sea's presence, pressing in on her from all sides. It was as though the town itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting to pull her under. Lisa reached the inn and hurried inside, the warmth of the lobby doing little to ease the chill in her bones. She climbed the stairs to her room, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key. Once inside, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. She needed to get a grip, needed to stay focused. But the image of that figure in the fog stayed with her, haunting her thoughts. She walked to the window and looked out at the town, shrouded in darkness and fog. Somewhere out there, the sea was waiting, its secrets buried deep beneath the waves. She could feel it calling to her, pulling her closer. And she knew deep down that she wouldn't be able to resist. She would find the truth, no matter the cost. But as the fog continued to roll in, blanketing the town in its suffocating embrace, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was already in over her head. And that whatever was out there, whatever was waiting, was far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, counting down the seconds until dawn. Lisa stood at the window, staring out into the darkness, the weight of the town's secrets pressing down on her. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just a tourist seeking a story. She was a part of Blackshore now, a part of its darkness, and there was no turning back. Chapter 4: The Journal in the Fog. The Blackshore Library was a relic of a bygone era, its weathered stone facade barely standing against the relentless Atlantic winds. Lisa pushed open the heavy oak door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and damp wood. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. The library was small, with rows of towering bookshelves that seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to keep their secrets hidden. Lisa's boots echoed on the creaky wooden floor as she made her way to the back of the room, where a small desk was occupied by an elderly woman with a pair of thick glasses perched on her nose. The woman looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Lisa's appearance. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I'm looking for information on the town's history," Lisa replied, forcing a friendly smile. Anything about the fishermen or ghost ships? The woman's expression darkened, and she hesitated before speaking. We don't get many people asking about that, she said slowly. Most folks around here prefer to let sleeping dogs lie. I'm not from around here, Lisa said, her smile widening. I'm a journalist doing a piece on coastal towns. I'd love to learn more about Blackshore. Unique history. The woman studied her for a moment, then sighed. Well, if you're determined, I suppose I can't stop you. Follow me. She led Lisa to a secluded corner of the library, where a small, locked cabinet stood. The woman produced a key from her pocket and unlocked it, revealing a collection of old, leather-bound journals and yellowed newspapers. These are the town records, the woman said, her voice low. They go back over 100 years. You'll find what you're looking for in here, but I warn you, some things are Teeter left buried. Lisa nodded, her heart racing with excitement. Thank you, I'll be careful. The woman gave her a final, wary look before retreating to her desk, leaving Lisa alone with the ancient tomes. She carefully pulled out the oldest-looking journal, its leather cover cracked and faded. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. As she began to read, a chill ran down her spine. The journal was filled with accounts of fishermen who had vanished into the fog, only to return days later with no memory of where they had been. There were sketches of a ghostly ship, its sails tattered and its hull blackened, as if it had emerged from the depths of hell. The descriptions were vivid, the fear palpable in every word. Lisa's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her mind racing with questions. What had these men seen? What had happened to them? And why had they returned only to be forever changed? The Drunken Sailor pub was alive with the sound of raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried fish, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the room. Lisa sat at the bar, nursing a pint of ale as she watched the fishermen gathered at the corner table. They were a rough-looking bunch, their faces weathered by years at sea, their voices low and guarded. She had come here hoping to overhear something useful, but so far, the men had been tight-lipped. She was about to give up when the door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Tommy, red, fallen, hesitated in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Lisa. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. After a moment, he made his way over to the bar and sat down beside her. "You're the blogger, right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa nodded, her curiosity piqued. "That's me, Lisa Monroe." Tommy glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. "I heard you've been asking questions about the disappearances." "That's right," Lisa said, leaning in closer. "Do you know something?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting to the corner table where the other fishermen sat. "I shouldn't be talking to you," he said, his voice trembling. "But I think you're in danger. You need to leave Blackshore, now." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "Why? What's going on?" Tommy shook his head, his face pale. "I can't say, just trust me. It's not safe here, not for you." Before Lisa could press him further, Tommy stood up and hurried out of the pub, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Her mind raced with possibilities. What had Tommy meant? What danger was she in? And why was he so afraid? The fog rolled in from the sea, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the town in its cold embrace. Lisa stood on the edge of the harbor, her camera in hand, as she watched the waves crash against the black rocks. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, and the sound of the wind was like a mournful wail. She had come here to clear her head, to try to make sense of everything she had learned. The journal, Tommy's warning, the ghost ship, it was all too much. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into the unknown. As she stared out at the sea, a strange feeling came over her. The fog seemed to shift, to move with a life of its own. And then she saw it. A ship emerged from the mist, its sails tattered and its hull blackened. It was the ghost ship from the journal, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she raised her camera, her hands trembling. But before she could take a photo, the ship vanished, swallowed by the fog once more. Lisa stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Had she really seen it? Or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? As she turned to leave, a voice whispered in her ear, so faint she almost missed it. Some come back, some don't. Lisa spun around, but there was no one there. The harbor was empty, the fog closing in around her. She felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, would she make it out alive? Chapter 5. The Ghost Ship's Whisper. The town of Blackshore lay shrouded in an early morning fog that clung to the narrow streets like a damp veil. The harbor, usually bustling with the sounds of fishermen preparing their boats, was eerily silent. The water lapped against the black rocks with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound, as if the sea itself were whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. Lisa Monroe stood at the edge of the dock, her breath visible in the cold air, her camera in hand. She had spent the night researching the town's history in the library, and what she had found had left her both intrigued and unsettled. Lisa had discovered an old journal, its pages yellowed with age, detailing the sightings of a ghost ship that appeared in the fog. The entries were written in a shaky hand, the ink faded but still legible. The ship was described as a spectral vessel, its sails tattered and its hull blackened as if it had been scorched by some unseen fire. The last entry in the journal was particularly chilling. The ship took him. It always takes them. The sea demands its due. She turned the camera on, the red light blinking as she began to record. This is Lisa Monroe, reporting from Blackshore. Today, I'm going to investigate the legend of the ghost ship, a tale that has haunted this town for generations. The journal I found last night suggests that the ship has a connection to the disappearances that have plagued Blackshore. But is it just a story, or is there something more to it? Lisa's words echoed in the stillness, swallowed by the fog. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the ghost ship lurking in the mist. But there was nothing, just the endless gray and the sound of the sea. The Drunken Sailor pub was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and smoke. Lisa stepped inside, her camera slung over her shoulder. The locals glanced up from their drinks, their eyes narrowing as they recognized her. She approached the bar, where a gruff bartender was polishing a glass with a cloth that had seen better days. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and wary. "Yes," Lisa replied, forcing a smile. "I'm looking for Caleb Hargrove. Is he here?" The bartender's eyes flicked toward a corner table, where an old man sat hunched over his drink. He had a weathered face, etched with deep lines, and his hands were gnarled from years of handling fishing nets. Caleb Hargrove. Lisa made her way over to the table, her heart pounding. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm Lisa Monroe. I was hoping to talk to you about the ghost ship." Caleb looked up, his eyes piercing despite their age. "The ghost ship, what do you know about that?" "I found an old journal in the library," Lisa said, pulling it from her bag. "It mentions sightings of the ship and its connection to the disappearances. I was hoping you could tell me more." Caleb's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Some come back, some don't. That's all there is to it." "But there must be more," Lisa insisted. "The journal says the ship takes people. Why? And why does the sea demand its due?" Caleb shook his head. "You're digging into things you don't understand, girl. Best leave it alone." Lisa's frustration bubbled to the surface. "People are disappearing, Mr. Hargrove. They're losing weight, losing their memories. Don't you think they deserve answers?" Caleb's expression darkened. "You think you're the first to come asking questions? You think you're the first to want answers? The sea doesn't give answers. It takes." Before Lisa could respond, Caleb pushed his chair back and stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He took one last look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning, then shuffled out of the pub, leaving Lisa alone at the table. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Caleb's words echoed in her mind. "Some come back, some don't." She needed to find out more, but it seemed that everyone in Blackshore was determined to keep their secrets. That evening, Lisa sat on the edge of the sea cliffs, the wind tugging at her hair. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, inky black, dotted with stars that seemed to watch her with cold indifference. The waves crashed against the rocks far below, their roar a constant, unrelenting reminder of the sea's power. She had come here to clear her head, but the events of the day had left her more unsettled than ever. Caleb's cryptic warnings, the ghost ship legend, the disappearances, it all swirled in her mind like the fog that clung to the town. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, something that could swallow her whole if she wasn't careful. Lisa pulled out her camera, flipping through the footage she had recorded. The ghost ship story was compelling, but it wasn't enough. She needed more, something that would make her video go viral, something that would prove she was onto something big. As she sat there, lost in thought, a sound caught her attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the sea itself. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She turned her camera toward the sound, the lens scanning the dark expanse of water. And then she saw it. A shape emerged from the fog, a ship with tattered sails and a blackened hull. It moved silently, gliding across the water as if it were a phantom. Lisa's heart raced as she zoomed in, her hands trembling. The ghost ship. The ship's deck was empty, its mast creaking in the wind. And yet, Lisa felt as if she were being watched, as if something on that ship knew. She was there. She couldn't tear her eyes away, couldn't stop filming, even as a sense of dread filled her chest. The ship began to fade, its form dissolving into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. Lisa lowered the camera, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had seen it. She had really seen it. But as she sat there, her mind racing, a question formed in the back of her mind, one that sent a chill down her spine. Did the ghost ship see her too? And if it did, what did it want? Chapter 6, The Journal of the Lost. The Blackshore Library was a relic of a bygone era, its towering oak shelves bowing under the weight of countless dusty tomes. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and mildew, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, eerie shadows across the room. Lisa Monroe stood at the center of it all, her breath shallow as she ran her fingers along the spine of an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the title barely legible. Log of the Mariner's Curse. Her heart pounded as she opened the journal, the brittle pages protesting with a soft crinkle. The handwriting was frantic, the ink faded but still discernible. She skimmed the entries, her eyes widening as she read. April 12, 1823. The fog came again today, thicker than ever. We saw her, the ghost ship. Her sails were tattered, her hull black as midnight. She appeared out of nowhere, and when she vanished, 3 of my crew were gone. No trace, no explanation. The sea takes what it will, and we are but playthings in its cruel game. Lisa's hands trembled as she flipped to the next page. The entries grew more disjointed, the writer's fear palpable. May 1st, 1823. The whispers haunt me. They say the ship is cursed, that those who see her are marked. I fear I am next. The sea, it calls to me. I can hear it even now. A voice, soothing and terrible. It speaks of the deep, of the hunger that lies beneath. I must resist. I must. The entry ended abruptly, the final word smudged as if the writer had been torn away mid-sentence. Lisa's pulse quickened. This was more than just an old fisherman's tale. It was a warning she couldn't ignore. Lisa stepped out of the library, the journal clutched tightly to her chest. The fog had rolled in again, blanketing the town in a ghostly shroud. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the black rocks. She felt eyes on her, though she saw no one. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. She made her way to Caleb Hargrove's cottage, the old fisherman's cryptic words echoing in her mind. Some come back, some don't. She needed answers, and he was the only one who might have them. The cottage was as decrepit as she remembered, its weathered siding sagging under years of neglect. She knocked on the door, the sound hollow and final. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing Caleb's weathered face. His eyes, sharp and piercing, bore into hers. "You again," he muttered, his voice gravelly and low. "What do you want?" Lisa held up the journal. "I found this in the library. It's about the ghost ship, the one that takes people. I need to know if it's real." Caleb's expression darkened. He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if they were alone, then gestured for her to come inside. The interior of the cottage was cluttered and dim, the air heavy with the scent of salt and old wood. Caleb led her to the kitchen, where a single lantern cast a flickering light over the table. He sat down heavily, his gnarled hands resting on the table. "You shouldn't have gone diggin' into that," he said, his tone grave. "Some things are better left buried." "People are disappearing, Caleb," Lisa pressed. "Don't you think they deserve answers?" Caleb's eyes flickered with something, guilt maybe, or fear. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you're the first to ask? I've seen that journal before. The man who wrote it, he was a friend of mine long time ago. He went out one night chassin' that ship, never came back." Lisa swallowed hard. "What happened to him?" Caleb shook his head. "Don't know, but I'll tell you this, that ship, it's real. And it's not the only thing, the sea, it's alive. It takes what it wants and it don't give it back. Some folks, they manage to come back, but they ain't the same. Hollow, like empty." Lisa's mind raced. Is that why the fishermen disappear? And the tourists, the sea, it's taking them? Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the fog-shrouded sea. "You best leave it alone, girl, if you know what's good for you." But Lisa couldn't leave it alone. Not now. She had to know the truth. The Drunken Sailor pub was dim and smoky, the air thick with the scent of sweat and cheap beer. Lisa sat at the corner table, her camera hidden beneath the table as she scanned the room. The fiche. RMN were gathered at the bar, their voices low and guarded. She had to get one of them to talk. Her gaze fell on Tommy Red Fallen, the youngest of the fishermen. He was fidgety, his hands shaking as he sipped his drink. She approached him cautiously, her smile friendly but insistent. "Hey, Tommy," she said, sliding into the seat beside him. "Mind if I join you?" Tommy glanced at her, his eyes wide and nervous. Sure, I guess." Lisa leaned in, her voice soft. "I need your help. I've been hearing a lot about the disappearances, the ghost ship. I was hoping you could tell me what you know." Tommy's face paled. He shook his head quickly. "I don't know nothing. You should ask someone else." "I'm asking you," Lisa insisted. "You're part of this, Tommy. You've seen it, haven't you? The ship, the fog." Tommy's hands trembled as he set his glass down. "I can't talk about it. They'd kill me if I did." "Who would?" Lisa pressed. "Who's behind this?" Tommy glanced around the room, his eyes darting to the other fishermen. "It's not just one person. It's the sea. It's always the sea. We're just pawns in its game. But there's others, people who profit from it, who make sure it keeps happening." Lisa's heart pounded. "Who, Tommy? Tell me." But before he could answer, Ethan Graves appeared at the table, his eyes cold and menacing. "You've got a lot of nerve, poking your nose where it don't belong," he snarled. "You think you're the first outsider to come here looking for answers? You're gonna end up just like the rest of them, lost at sea." Lisa's blood ran cold. She stood, backing away from the table. "I'm not going to stop," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Not until I find out the truth." Ethan's lips curled into a cruel smile. "We'll see about that." Lisa stepped out of the pub, the cold night air biting at her skin. She felt more lost than ever, the weight of the town's secrets pressing down on her. But she couldn't give up. Not now, not when she was so close. She made her way to the harbor, the fog so thick she could barely see her own hand in front of her face. The sound of the waves was deafening, a steady rhythm that seemed to call to her. She stopped at the edge of the dock, staring out into the black void. And then she saw it, the ghost ship. Its silhouette emerged from the fog, its tattered sails billowing in the wind. It was real. It was here. Her heart raced as she fumbled for her camera, desperate to capture the moment. But as she raised the camera, the ship vanished, swallowed by the fog once more. She stood there, frozen, the reality of what she'd seen sinking in. "Some come back," she whispered, Caleb's words echoing in her mind. "Some don't." And in that moment, she knew she was marked. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Ethan Graves stood there, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said it all. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She knew what was coming next. The fog closed in around her, and everything went black. Chapter 7, Whispers in the Fog. The fog had rolled in early that morning, shrouding Blackshore in an eerie blanket of gray. The harbor was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of waves crashing against the rocks muffled by the thick mist. Lisa Monroe stood at the edge of the dock, her breath visible in the cold air. She clutched her camera tightly, the lens cap dangling from her wrist. The drunken sailor pub loomed behind her, its sign creaking in the wind. She had spent the night there, listening to the fishermen's drunken tales and trying to piece together the mystery that had brought her to this forsaken town. Lisa glanced at her watch. It was barely past dawn, but she had been up for hours, her mind racing with questions. The journal she had found in the town's library was tucked safely in her bag, the pages filled with accounts of ghost ships and disappearances. She had read it cover to cover, unable to shake the feeling that it held the key to unlocking the town's secrets. But the more she learned, the more she realized how little she truly understood. The sound of footsteps on the wooden dock made her turn. Tommy, red fallen, was approaching, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his weather-beaten jacket. His red hair was damp from the fog, and his face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. "Morning, Lisa," he said, his voice low. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," she replied, forcing a smile. "Too much on my mind." Tommy nodded, his gaze drifting to the water. "The fog's bad today, not a good time to be out on the sea." Lisa stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Tommy, I need to know more about the disappearances, about the ghost ship. You've lived here your whole life, you must have heard stories." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Some things are better left alone, Lisa. The sea, it doesn't like people digging into its secrets." "But people are disappearing," she said. "Don't you want to know why? Don't you want to stop it?" Tommy's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might walk away. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right, I'll tell you what I know, but not here, too many ears." He gestured for her to follow, and she fell into step beside him as they walked away from the harbor. The fog swallowed the town, the buildings fading into the mist. The streets were deserted, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel. "The ghost ship," Tommy began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been part of Blackshore's lore for as long as anyone can remember. They say it appears in the fog, a specter from the past. Those who see it, they don't come back, or if they do, they're never the same." Lisa shivered, the cold seeping into her bones. "What do you mean, never the same?" Tommy stopped, turning to face her. His eyes were haunted, filled with a fear that sent a chill down her spine. "They're emptier, like something been taken from them. Their memories, their souls, who knows, but they're not whole anymore." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. "And the disappearances, are they connected?" He nodded slowly. "Some say the ship takes them. Others think it's the sea itself, punishing those who disturb its peace. But no one really knows, not for sure." Lisa reached into her bag, pulling out the journal. "I found this in the library. It's filled with accounts of the ship, of people disappearing. There's something here, Tommy, something important." He stared at the journal, his expression unreadable. "Be careful, Lisa. The more you dig, the more dangerous it becomes. There are some who won't take kindly to your questions." "Like Ethan Graves?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Tommy's eyes darkened and he looked away. "Ethan, complicated. He's been through a lot. But yeah, he's not one to mess with, and neither are the others." Lisa nodded, her resolve hardening. "I have to know the truth, Tommy, whatever it takes." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the fog. Lisa stood there for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She opened the journal, flipping through the pages. The answers were here, hidden in the faded ink and cryptic notes. She just had to find them. Later that afternoon, Lisa sat at the bar in the Drunken Sailor, a cup of coffee in her hands. The pub was quiet, the only sounds the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. She had spent the morning poring over the journal, but the more she read, the more questions she had. The door creaked open, and Caleb Hargrove shuffled in, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He nodded to the bartender and made his way to the corner table, where a group of fishermen sat in silence. Lisa watched him cautiously, her heart pounding. Caleb was the oldest fisherman in Blackshore, and according to Tommy, he knew more about the town's secrets than anyone. But he was also the most guarded, his words often cryptic and filled with warnings. She took a deep breath and stood, making her way to the corner table. The fishermen glanced up as she approached, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice steady, "can I ask you a few questions?" Caleb looked up, his eyes piercing through her. "Depends on the questions." She pulled out a chair and sat down, the journal in her lap. "I've been researching the disappearances, the ghost ship. I think there's more to it than just folklore." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. There's more, but are you sure you want to know?" "I need to know," she replied, her voice firm. "People are disappearing. People like Ethan Graves, I can't just ignore it." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. The fog was still thick, the world outside a blur of gray. "The sea's a fickle mistress," he said, his voice low. "She gives and she takes. Some say she's cursed. Others say it's just her nature. But one thing for sure, once she's got her claws in you, there's no escaping." Lisa's hands trembled as she opened the journal, flipping to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "This journal, it talks about rituals, about sacrifices. Do you think that's what's happening? Is the sea taking people as payment?" Caleb's eyes darkened and he leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "Some say the sea demands a price. Blood, memories, souls. Those who disappear, they're not just lost. They're taken. And those who come back, they're never the same." She felt a chill run down her spine, her heart pounding in her chest. But why? Why would the sea demand such a thing? Caleb's gaze was unreadable, his voice barely audible. "To keep the balance. The sea gives life, but she also takes it. And if the balance is disturbed, well, that's when things get dangerous." Lisa swallowed hard, her mind racing. "And what about the fishermen, the ones who know more than they let on? Are they part of it?" Caleb's expression hardened, and he shook his head. "That's not a question you should be asking, girl. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." She opened her mouth to press further, but the look in his eyes silenced her. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked away without another word. Lisa sat there, her heart pounding, the journal heavy in her hands. She had more questions than ever, but one thing was clear: the sea was at the center of it all. And if she wanted to uncover the truth, she would have to face it head-on. As night fell, Lisa found herself standing at the base of the Blackshore lighthouse, its towering structure looming above her like a sentinel. The fog had thickened, the world around her a swirling mass of gray. The beam of the lighthouse cut through the mist, casting eerie shadows on the ground. She had come here on a hunch, following a cryptic note she had found tucked in the journal. The handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible. "The lighthouse holds the key, but beware the keeper." Lisa took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she approached the door. It was unlocked, the hinges creaking as she pushed it open. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of salt. She pulled out her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The staircase spiraled upward, the steps worn and uneven. She began to climb, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The higher she went, the thicker the air became, until she could barely breathe. She reached the top, her flashlight illuminating the small room that housed the light. The keeper's chair was empty, but the room was far from abandoned. Scraps of paper littered the floor, covered in the same shaky handwriting as the note. She knelt down, picking up one of the papers. It was a map of the coastline, with strange symbols drawn in the margins. As she studied the map, a chill ran down her spine. She felt a presence behind her, the air growing colder. She turned, her flashlight beam illuminating the figure standing in the doorway. It was Caleb Hargrove, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lisa stood, her heart pounding. I found a note. It said the lighthouse holds the key. Caleb stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on her. The key to what? To the disappearances, to the ghost ship, to whatever's happening here. He shook his head, his expression grim. You're playing with fire, girl. The lighthouse, it's not what you think. It's a warning, a beacon for those who have been marked. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Marked? What do you mean? Caleb stepped closer, his voice a whisper. The sea doesn't just take anyone, it chooses, and once you're marked, there's no escaping. She felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Am I marked? He didn't answer, his gaze drifting to the window. The fog outside was swirling, the beam of the lighthouse cutting through it like a knife. And then, in the distance, she saw it, the faint outline of a ship, its sails tattered, its hull dark and foreboding. Her heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The ghost ship, it was real. Caleb's voice was barely audible as he spoke. It's too late, Lisa. You've seen it, and now it's seen you. Lisa stood frozen, her flashlight slipping from her fingers as the ghost ship emerged from the fog, its haunting presence filling her with a dread she couldn't shake. The beam of the lighthouse flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw figures on the deck, their faces pale and lifeless. Caleb's hand gripped her arm, his voice urgent. You need to leave, now, before it's too late. But Lisa couldn't move, her eyes fixed on the ship. It was closer now, its shadow stretching across the water. And then, as if in a dream, she heard a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lisa. Her blood ran cold, and she turned to Caleb, her voice barely a whisper. Did you hear that? But he was gone, the room empty except for her and the ghostly ship. The voice came again, louder this time, filling her mind with a sense of dread she couldn't escape. Lisa, come to me. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, the journal slipping from her hands. The ship was almost upon her, its shadow swallowing the lighthouse. And as the fog closed in, she knew one thing for certain. The sea had marked her, and there was no escape. Chapter 8. The Shadow Beneath the Waves. The fog rolled in heavy that evening, swallowing the town of Blackshore in its damp embrace. Lisa stood at the harbor, the wooden planks creaking beneath her feet. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the only sound was the distant toll of the lighthouse bell, a mournful echo that seemed to reverberate through her bones. Her camera hung at her side, its lens capped against the mist, but she could feel its weight as though it were pulling her down into the murky depths of the sea. She had come here for answers, but the sea had only given her questions. The harbor was deserted, the fishing boats moored like ghostly sentinels in the gloom. Their weathered hulls bore the scars of countless storms, their nets hanging limp and heavy with the weight of the fog. Lisa's eyes drifted to the Sea Witch, Ethan Graves' boat. It was the only vessel that seemed out of place, its ropes frayed and its deck cluttered with strange, unidentifiable objects. She hesitated, her hand brushing against the cold metal of the railing. The boat seemed to call to her, a siren song that whispered of secrets and danger. She stepped aboard, her boots thudding softly against the wood. The air was colder here, the fog thicker, as though the sea itself were trying to push her away. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the deck for any sign of life. The wheelhouse loomed ahead, its windows fogged and opaque. Inside, the faint glow of a lantern cast flickering shadows on the walls, and Lisa's heart began to race. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, and pulled it open. The air inside was stale, tinged with the smell of rotting wood and something else, something sharp and metallic that made her stomach turn. The lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling, its flame dancing wildly as though it were alive. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the wood with a crude hand. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, their shapes twisting and shifting as she stared at them. Lisa raised her camera, her finger hovering over the shutter button, but a voice from behind made her freeze. You shouldn't be here. She turned sharply, her heart pounding in her chest. Tommy Fallon stood in the doorway, his red hair damp and disheveled, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, frantic, and he took a step forward, his hand outstretched as though to grab her. What are you doing here? She demanded, her voice trembling. This boat belongs to Ethan Graves. He's gone, disappeared just like the others. Tommy shook his head, his expression a mix of fear and desperation. You don't understand, Lisa. You can't be here. It's not safe. The sea, it doesn't care who you are. It'll take you just like it took Ethan. Lisa's grip on her camera tightened. What are you talking about? What do you know about Ethan? About the disappearances? Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting to the symbols on the walls. He opened his mouth to speak, but a sudden crash from outside made them both jump. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to come from the depths of the sea itself. Lisa turned to the window, her breath catching in her throat. The fog had parted, revealing a massive wave towering over the harbor. It was like nothing she had ever seen, its crest gleaming darkly in the dim light, its surface rippling with an unnatural energy. "Get out!" Tommy shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. "It's coming." The Drunken Sailor pub was a refuge from the storm, its warm light spilling out into the foggy street. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke, the low murmur of voices creating a comforting hum. Lisa sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, her clothes still damp from the rain. Across from her, Tommy Fallon leaned forward, his face shadowed with worry. "You're lucky I found you when I did," he said, his voice low. "That wave, it wasn't natural, it was a warning." Lisa frowned, her fingers tightening around the mug. "A warning? From who? The sea? That's ridiculous." Tommy shook his head, his eyes dark. "You don't get it, do you? This town, it's cursed. The sea takes what it wants and it doesn't give it back. Ethan knew that. He tried to fight it, but in the end, it was too much for him." Lisa leaned forward, her curiosity piqued despite her fear. "What do you mean he tried to fight it? What exactly is it, Tommy? What's really going on here?" Tommy hesitated, his gaze flicking to the other patrons in the pub. No one seemed to be paying them any attention, but he still lowered his voice to a whisper. "There's something out there, Lisa. Something old. Something that doesn't belong in this world. The fishermen, they've been making deals with it for generations. They give it what it wants, and it leaves the rest of us alone. But Ethan, he couldn't do it anymore. He tried to break the deal, and now he's gone." Lisa's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. It sounded like madness, but there was something in his voice, something desperate and real, that made her believe him. "And what does it want? What does the sea take?" Tommy's expression darkened. "People." "Lisa, it takes people, but not just anyone. It takes those who are willing to give themselves up, those who have nothing left to lose. The fishermen, they've been sacrificing their own to keep the sea at bay. But now something's changed. It's hungrier than ever, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities. If what Tommy was saying was true, then the disappearances weren't random. They were deliberate. They were sacrifices. But why, and who was behind it? Before she could ask any more questions, the door to the pub burst open, and a hush fell over the room. Caleb Hargrove stood in the doorway, his grizzled face twisted into a scowl. His eyes scanned the room, finally landing on Lisa and Tommy. He stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him, and the murmurs of the patrons ceased entirely. "You too," he growled, his voice like gravel. "You're meddling in things you don't understand. You'll end up like Ethan if you're not careful." The town square was eerily quiet as Lisa walked home, her mind still reeling from the encounter with Caleb Hargrove. The fog had thickened again, blotting out the stars and the moon, and the only sound was the distant crashing of waves against the cliffs. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. She felt as though she were walking through a dream, the world around her shifting and warping with every step. She paused at the base of the lighthouse, its towering form a dark silhouette against the night sky. The beacon was dark, its light extinguished, and the air around it was unnaturally still. Lisa's hand drifted to her camera, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She hesitated, then raised it to her eye, peering through the viewfinder. The lighthouse seemed empty, abandoned, but something about it drew her in. She stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, its hinges rusted and creaking in the wind. Lisa pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. The air inside was cold and damp, the walls lined with spiraling stairs that led up into the darkness. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and began to climb. The stairs seemed to go on forever, each step echoing in the silence. The higher she climbed, the colder it became, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. Finally, she reached the top, where the beacon should have been, but instead of the light, she found something else. The room was small and circular, its walls covered in the same strange symbols she had seen on Ethan's boat. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, their shapes twisting and writhing as though alive. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a book. Lisa stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The cover was old and worn, the title etched in faded gold letters. The Chronicles of Blackshore. She opened the book, the pages crackling with age. The writing was a mix of journal entries and drawings, images of the sea and the strange creatures that lurked beneath its surface. But what caught her eye was the final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand. The sea demands sacrifice. It cannot be denied. But beware, for those who return are not as they seem. The sea takes something from them, something they can never get back. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. She felt a chill run down her spine, and the air around her seemed to grow heavier. Chapter 9. The Ghost Ship's Warning. The fog clung to Blackshore like a shroud, its tendrils slithering through the narrow streets and curling around the weathered buildings. The town was eerily silent, save for the distant crash of waves against the black rocks. Lisa Monroe pulled her coat tighter around herself as she walked towards the town square, her breath visible in the cold air. The dampness seeped into her bones, adding to the unease that had settled in her chest since her return from the sea. The drunken sailor pub loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly in the mist. Lisa hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the worn brass handle. She had avoided this place since her return, but tonight she needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warm, smoky air hit her like a wall, carrying with it the scent of stale beer and fried food. The pub was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered across the room. They glanced up as she entered, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Lisa forced a smile and made her way to the bar, where the bartender was polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "Whiskey neat," she said, sliding onto a stool. The bartender nodded and poured her a shot, sliding it across the bar without a word. Lisa downed it in one gulp, the burn in her throat doing little to settle her nerves. "Rough night," a voice asked from behind he. Our Lisa turned to see Tommy, red, fallen, standing there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "You could say that," Lisa replied, forcing another smile. "Join me." Tommy hesitated, then nodded and took the stool next to her. The bartender placed another whiskey in front of him, and Tommy sipped it slowly, his eyes darting around the room. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," he said after a moment. "After everything." Lisa shrugged, tracing the rim of her glass with her finger. "I couldn't stay away. There are too many questions, Red, too many things that don't add up." Tommy's jaw tightened, and he looked down at his drink. "Some things are better left alone, Lisa. You of all people should know that." "Maybe," she admitted, "but I can't just let it go, not now, not after what happened." Tommy sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have gone out there. None of us should. The sea. It's not what it seems." Lisa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "What do you mean? What's out there, Red?" He shook his head, his eyes distant. "I can't say. Not here, not now." "Then when? Where?" Lisa pressed, her voice rising slightly. She caught herself and glanced around, but the other patrons seemed disinterested. Tommy fumbled with his drink, his hands trembling slightly. "There's a place, the Cliffs of Despair. There's a cave there. If you really want answers, that's where you'll find them. But I'm telling you, Lisa, don't go. Whatever you think you're looking for, it's not worth it." Lisa studied his face, searching for any sign that he was lying or joking. But there was only fear in his eyes. Fear and something else. Regret, maybe. "I have to know," she whispered. "I have to." Tommy nodded slowly, as if he had expected her answer. "Then be careful, and whatever you do, don't go alone." The cave was exactly where Tommy had said it would be, hidden among the jagged rocks of the cliffs of despair. The wind howled around Lisa as she made her way down the narrow path, the sound like the cries of the lost. The sea below churned wildly, its dark waters ominous and unrelenting. She paused at the entrance to the cave, her flashlight flickering as she aimed it inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls slick with moisture and the occasional glint of something metallic. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and decay. "Hello," Lisa called, her voice echoing down the passage. There was no response, but she thought she heard the faint sound of whispering. She swallowed hard and stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hand. The cave was larger than she had expected, with branching tunnels that seemed to go on forever. She followed the main passage, her footsteps crunching on the gravelly floor. The whispering grew louder, though she couldn't make out the words. It was as if the cave itself was speaking to her, its voice low and insistent. She turned a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber, its walls covered in strange symbols carved into the rock. In the center of the room was a massive stone altar, its surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she approached the altar. There were more symbols etched into its surface, but she couldn't decipher them. She reached out to touch the stone, but before her fingers could make contact, the whispering stopped. The air grew still, and Lisa's flashlight flickered and died. She fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, but it was no use. The darkness closed in around her, suffocating and absolute. And then she heard it, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It reverberated through the chamber, shaking the walls and sending a chill down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something moving in the darkness. Lisa backed away from the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. A pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She took another step back, and her foot caught on something. She stumbled and fell, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the rough floor. The eyes drew closer, and the growl turned into a low, menacing chuckle. Lisa's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she tried to crawl away, but the creature was too fast. She felt a cold, clawed hand close around her ankle, and she screamed. Lisa woke with a start, her heart racing and her body drenched in sweat. She was in her room at the inn, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she lay there, trying to steady her breathing and convince herself that it had all been a dream. But as she sat up, she noticed something on the floor beside her bed. It was a piece of paper, folded neat. Lie and sealed with wax. Hands trembling, she picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a single sentence, written in a shaky hand. "The ghost ship comes with the fog. Beware its call, for it marks the end." Lisa stared at the note, her mind racing. She had no memory of receiving it, but the fear in her heart told her one thing for certain. The answers she sought were closer than ever, and they were more dangerous than she could have imagined. Chapter 10. The Fog's Embrace. The harbor of Blackshore was shrouded in a thick, oppressive fog that seemed to swallow the world whole. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, and the only sounds were the distant cries of gulls and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the dock. Lisa Monroe stood at the edge of the pier, her breath visible in the cold, damp air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the small, leather-bound journal she had discovered in the town's library. The journal, filled with cryptic entries about the ghost ship, felt like a ticking time bomb in her hands. She knew she was onto something big, something that could make her channel go viral, but the deeper she dug, the more she felt the weight of Blackshore's secrets pressing down on her. "Lisa," a voice called out from behind her, startling her. She turned to see Tommy, red, fallen, approaching, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. His red hair was damp from the fog, and his face was pale, his usual nervous energy replaced by a somber seriousness. "Tommy," she replied, trying to steady her voice, "what brings you out here in this weather?" He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the foggy sea. "I could ask you the same question. You shouldn't be out here alone, Lisa. It's not safe. She held up the journal. I found something important. It's about the ghost ship, the disappearances. I think there's a connection. Tommy's expression darkened. You need to stop digging, Lisa. Whatever you think you've found, it's not worth it. People who ask too many questions, they don't come back. People like Ethan Graves, she shot back, her voice rising. What happened to him, Tommy? Why did his boat disappear? Why did I come back, but he didn't? Tommy shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. You don't understand. The sea, it doesn't give up its secrets easily, and those who try to uncover them, they pay the price. Lisa stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. Then help me understand. Tell me what you know. I just want the truth. For a moment, Tommy looked like he might speak, but then he turned away, his shoulders hunched. I can't, Lisa, I can't. The Drunken Sailor pub was a refuge from the fog, but its dim lighting and smoky atmosphere offered little comfort. Lisa sat at a corner table, nursing a drink and trying to make sense of the cryptic entries in the journal. The old photographs and nautical instruments on the walls seemed to watch her, their eyes filled with secrets. The jukebox played a haunting sea shanty, the melody weaving through the air like a ghostly whisper. Caleb Hargrove sat across from her, his gnarled hands resting on the table. His weathered face was unreadable, his eyes like two dark voids. Lisa had managed to convince him to meet her, but she wasn't sure if he would talk. What do you want to know? He asked, his voice a low rumble. The ghost ship, she said, sliding the journal across the table. I found this in the library. It talks about sightings, about disappearances. I think it's connected to what's happening now. Caleb glanced at the journal but didn't touch it. The sea takes and gives as it will, girl. You can't change that. You can't understand it. But I need to try, she insisted. People are disappearing, Caleb. They're coming back changed or not coming back at all. I need to know why. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the fog pressed against the glass. Some come back, some don't. That's all there is to it. Lisa's frustration boiled over. That's not an answer. People's lives are at stake. My life is at stake. I came back from that boat, but I don't remember anything. What happened to me? What happened to Ethan? Caleb's eyes flicked back to her, and for a moment she thought she saw a glimmer of something, pity perhaps, or fear. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic mask. You survived. That's all that matters. Go home, Lisa. Leave the sea to itself. The fog was thicker now, a living entity that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Lisa stood on the cliffs, the journal clutched to her chest. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the cries of the lost. She had come here seeking answers, but all she found was more questions. She opened the journal to a page she had marked, the words written in a shaky hand. The ship appears in the fog, a phantom of the sea. Those who see it are never the same. Some say I. T is a curse, others a blessing. But all agree it is a harbinger of doom. A chill ran down her spine as she stared out at the sea. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their roar echoing through the night. And then, through the fog, she saw it, a shape, dark and indistinct, moving on the horizon. Her breath caught in her throat as the ship emerged from the mist, its sails tattered, its hull blackened and charred. It was the ghost ship. Her heart pounded as she watched it glide silently across the water, a spectral vessel from another world. She felt a pull, an irresistible urge to follow, to step off the cliff and join the ship in its eternal voyage. Her foot moved forward, inching closer to the edge. Lisa, a voice screamed, breaking the spell. She turned to see Tommy running towards her, his face a mask of panic. He grabbed her arm and yanked her back from the edge, his grip like iron. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. I saw it, she stammered, her legs giving way as she collapsed to the ground. The ghost ship, it was there, Tommy, it called to me. He knelt beside her, his eyes filled with fear. You can't let it take you, Lisa, you can't. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. What is it? What does it want? Tommy hesitated, then sighed. It's the sea's curse. It takes those it deems worthy, those who seek its secrets. You survived once, Lisa, but if it calls you again, you might not be so lucky. The fog lifted slightly as Lisa made her way back to town, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had seen the ghost ship, felt its pull, and now, more than ever, she was determined to uncover the truth. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the fog itself was alive, waiting for the right moment to claim her. She reached her room at the small inn and locked the door behind her. The journal lay on the table, its pages filled with secrets she couldn't yet understand. She opened it to a random page, and her eyes fell on a single line. The sea's curse is eternal, and those who seek to break it will find only madness. Her hands trembled as she closed the journal, the weight of Blackshore's secrets pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. But as she lay down on the bed, the fog outside her window seemed to whisper her name, a siren's call she couldn't ignore. The night was quiet, the fog a thick blanket over the town. Lisa sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the journal. She had read through it twice, but the answers she sought were still elusive. The ghost ship, the disappearances, the curse, it was all connected, but how? Her mind drifted back to the ship she had seen on the cliffs, the way it had called to her. She had felt its pull, its irresistible allure. And now, as she sat in the silence of her room, she realized something. She wanted to see it again. No, she needed to see it again. She grabbed her coat and slipped out of the inn, the fog swallowing her whole as she made her way to the cliffs. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the cries of the lost. She reached the edge of the cliffs and looked out at the water, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, through the fog, she saw it, the ghost ship, its tattered sails billowing in the wind. It was closer this time, its dark hull gliding silently across the water. She felt the pull again, stronger this time, an almost physical force drawing her towards the edge. "Come," a voice whispered in her ear, soft and seductive. "Join us." Her foot moved forward, inching closer to the edge of the cliff. The ship was so close now, its deck illuminated by an eerie, otherworldly light. She could see figures moving on board, their forms shadowy and indistinct. "Lisa," another voice called, this one desperate and urgent. "Don't do it." She turned to see Tommy running towards her, his face pale with fear. He reached out to grab her, but she stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the cliff. And then she was falling, the fog rushing up to meet her as the ghost ship loomed in the distance, its sails billowing in the wind. The water was cold, so cold it burned. Lisa gasped as she surfaced, the shock of the icy sea jolting her back to reality. She coughed and sputtered, her arms flailing as she tried to stay afloat. The fog was thick around her, but she could still see the ghost ship, its dark hull looming in the distance. She swam towards it, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The ship seemed to be drifting away, its tattered sails billowing in the wind. She pushed herself to swim faster, her muscles screaming in protest as the cold sapped her strength. And then, just as she was about to reach the ship, it vanished, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there at all. Lisa floated in the water, her breath coming in rag. Gasps. She was alone, the fog pressing in on her from all sides. The sea was silent, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against her body. And then, as if from a great distance, she heard a voice, soft and seductive, whispering her name. "Lisa." She turned her head, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw it, a figure, dark and indistinct, emerging from the fog. It reached out to her, its hand mere inches from her face. And then everything went black. Chapter 11, The Ghost in the Fog. The fog rolled in heavy and thick, swallowing the town of Blackshore in its cold embrace. Lisa stood at the edge of the harbor, her breath visible in the chill air. The waves crashed against the black rocks, their rhythm both soothing and ominous. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the dampness seeping into her bones. The town behind her was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of the fishermen replaced by an unsettling silence. Even the gulls had gone quiet, their cries swallowed by the fog. Lisa's eyes fixed on the horizon, though there was nothing to see but the endless gray. The ghost ship, Caleb's words echoed in her mind. She had dismissed his cryptic hints as the ramblings of an old man, but now, standing in the fog, she wasn't so sure. The journal she had found in the library had mentioned sightings of the ship, always in weather like this. She had thought it was just folklore, a story to scare tourists. But what if it was? What if it was real? You shouldn't be out here alone. Lisa jumped, her heart pounding as she turned to see Tommy Fallon approaching. His red hair was damp, clinging to his forehead, and his face was pale, almost ghostly in the fog. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his eyes hollow and haunted. "Tommy," Lisa said, trying to steady her voice, "you scared me." "You should be scared," he replied, his voice low and urgent. "The fog, it's different tonight. Can't you feel it?" Lisa hesitated. She could feel it, the weight in the air, the sense of something watching, waiting. But she didn't want to admit it, not even to herself. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Tommy glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the fog as if expecting something to emerge. "The ship," he whispered. "It's out there, I've seen it." Lisa's breath caught. "You've seen it when?" "Last night," Tommy said, his voice trembling. "I was out on the water checking the nets. It came out of nowhere, just appeared in the fog. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was real. I swear it was real." Lisa stared at him, her mind racing. If Tommy had seen the ship, then maybe Caleb's stories weren't just stories. Maybe the ship was tied to the disappearances, to the miracle. She needed to know more. "What did it look like?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's face paled further. "It was old," he said, "like something from another time. The sails were tattered and the hull was black, darker than the water. And the silence, there was no sound, no wind, no waves, just nothing." Lisa shivered, her skin prickling. She could almost see it, the black ship gliding through the fog, silent and ghostly. But as much as it scared her, she couldn't look away. She had to know the truth. "Tommy," she said, her voice firm despite the fear coiling in her gut. "I need to see it. I need to know what's really out there." Tommy shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "No, Lisa, you don't understand. It's dangerous. You don't know what you're messing with." "I don't care," Lisa said, her determination solidifying. "I can't just ignore this. People are disappearing, Tommy. I need to know why." Tommy stared at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of fear and resignation. Finally, he sighed. "Fine," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." Lisa stood on the deck of Tommy's boat, the fog swirling around her like a living thing. The engine hummed softly beneath her feet, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Tommy was at the wheel, his hands gripping it tightly, his knuckles white. He hadn't said a word since they left the harbor, his eyes fixed on the water ahead. Lisa scanned the fog, her heart pounding. The air was heavy, the smell of salt and decay filling her nostrils. She could feel the weight of the fog pressing down on her, suffocating her, but she wouldn't back down, not now. "There," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. Lisa followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The fog seemed to part, revealing a shape in the distance, a ship, its black hull gliding silently through the water. The sails were tattered, just as Tommy had described, and the silence was absolute. Lisa's heart raced as she stared at the ship, her mind reeling. It was real. The ghost ship was real. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what do we do?" Tommy didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ship, his face pale and drawn. He looked as though he had seen a ghost, and maybe he had. The ship loomed closer, its presence growing more oppressive with every passing second. Lisa could feel the pull of it, the way the air seemed to shift, drawing her toward it. She wanted to look away, to turn and run, but she couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the ship. And then she saw them, figures on the deck, their forms indistinct, their faces obscured by the fog. They moved silently, their movements unnaturally smooth, as if they weren't really there. "Tommy," Lisa said, her voice barely a whisper, "do you see them?" Tommy nodded, his face white as a sheet. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Lisa didn't argue. Her heart was pounding, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned to Tommy, ready to tell him to start the engine, but the words caught in her throat. The ship was closer now, so close she could see the details of its blackened hull, the way the wood seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. The figures on the deck were clearer now, their faces still obscured, but their presence more tangible. Lisa's mind screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible, but her body refused to move. She was frozen, her eyes locked on the ship, her breath coming in shallow gasps. And then the ship was upon them. Lisa woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. She was lying on the floor of Tommy's boat, the fog still thick around her. Tommy was slumped against the wheel, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Lisa scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. What had happened? The ship. She remembered the ship, the figures on the deck, but everything else was a blur. "Tommy," she said, shaking him gently. "Tommy, wake up." Tommy groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his expression dazed. "Lisa," he said, his voice hoarse. "What happened?" Lisa shook her head. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. I think we saw the ship." Tommy's eyes widened and he sat up abruptly, his face pale. "The ship," he whispered. "It was real, it took us." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "Took us," she repeated. "What do you mean?" Tommy looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. "We were gone," he said. "For days, I remember the ship, the fog, and then nothing until now." Lisa stared at him, her mind reeling. Gone for days? But that was impossible. They had just been out on the water for a few hours, hadn't they? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an engine approaching. She turned to see a boat emerging from the fog, Ethan's boat. Ethan's face was grim as he pulled up alongside them. "What the hell are you two doing out here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She didn't know what had happened, but one thing was clear: something had changed. The sea had taken them, and now they were left with more questions than answers. As Ethan helped them onto his boat, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The ghost ship was real, and it wasn't done with them. Not yet. Chapter 12. The Ghost Ship. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the harbor in an oppressive silence. Lisa stood at the edge of the dock, her breath visible in the cold, damp air. The black rocks jutted out from the water like jagged teeth, and the waves crashed against them with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence. She clutched the old journal she had found in the town's library, its pages filled with cryptic entries about the ghost ship that haunted Blackshore's waters. The journal was her only lead, a thread connecting the disappearances to the town's dark folklore. The air smelled of salt and decay, and the faint sound of a bell tolling in the distance sent a shiver down her spine. Lisa glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her. But the harbor was deserted, the fishermen having retreated to their homes or the warm confines of the drunken sailor pub. She was alone with the sea and its secrets. Lisa made her way to Caleb Hargrove's cottage, the journal tucked securely under her arm. The old fisherman's home was as much a relic as the man himself, its weathered walls leaning precariously as though succumbing to the weight of the town's history. The overgrown weeds and broken fishing nets that surrounded the cottage gave it an air of neglect, but Lisa knew better. Inside, Caleb guarded secrets darker than the sea itself. She rapped on the door, the sound echoing hollowly. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing Caleb's gaunt face framed by a scraggly beard. His eyes, pale and rheumy, fixed on her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "I didn't think I'd see you again," he said, his voice rough, like gravel dragged across wood. "I need your help," Lisa replied, holding up the journal. "I found this in the library. It talks about the ghost ship. I think it's connected to the disappearances." Caleb's face darkened, and he stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. The interior of the cottage was cluttered with old fishing gear and strange relics from the sea. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and something faintly metallic, like blood. Lisa followed him to the kitchen, where a wood-burning stove emitted a feeble warmth. You're playing with fire, Caleb warned, sitting heavily at the table. That journal, it's best left alone. Why? Lisa pressed, sitting across from him. What aren't you telling me? Caleb hesitated, his gnarled hands clutching the edge of the table. The ghost ship, it's not just a story, it's real, and it's cursed. Those who see it, they don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all. Lisa's heart raced, her mind flashing to her own disappearance. The fog, the boat, the blank days she couldn't remember. I saw it, she whispered. When I was out on the sea, it was there in the fog. Caleb's eyes widened, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Then you've been marked. The ship has its eye on you. It's only a matter of time before it comes for you again. Lisa left Caleb's cottage with a sense of unease that settled deep in her chest. The old fisherman's words echoed in her mind as she walked through the fog-shrouded streets of Blackshore. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something or someone was following her. The town felt alive, its narrow streets twisting and turning like a maze designed to trap her. She found herself at the edge of the sea cliffs, the wind tugging at her hair and clothes. The view was both breathtaking and terrifying, the black rocks below rising like jagged teeth from the churning water. She stared out at the sea, the fog rolling in waves across the surface, and felt a pull, a strange, irresistible compulsion to go closer. You shouldn't be here. Lisa spun around to see Tommy, red, fallen, standing a few feet away, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes bloodshot and darting nervously. What are you doing here? She asked, taking a step toward him. Tommy shook his head, backing away. It's not safe. None of it's safe. You need to leave Blackshore, Lisa, before it's too late. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice rising. What do you know about the ghost ship, about the disappearances? Tommy hesitated, his eyes flicking to the sea and back to her. I can't tell you. They'll know. They're always watching. Who's watching? Lisa pressed, her frustration bubbling over. Tommy, you have to tell me something. People are disappearing. I disappeared, and I came back different. Tommy's face crumpled and he looked away. It's the ritual, he muttered. The old rituals, they're still being performed. The sea demands a sacrifice, and those who are chosen, they don't have a choice. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean, chosen? Before Tommy could answer, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the town. He flinched, his eyes wide with terror. They're coming, he whispered. You need to run. Lisa's heart pounded as she sprinted through the streets of Blackshore, the sound of footsteps echoing behind her. The fog closed in, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. She didn't know who was following her, but the urgency in Tommy's voice had been enough to drive her to flee. She ducked into an alley, pressing herself against the cold, damp wall as she tried to catch her breath. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. She heard voices, low, guttural murmurs that sent a chill down her spine. They were close, too close. Her mind raced, thinking of the journal, Caleb's warnings, Tommy's cryptic words. The ritual, the sacrifice, the ghost ship. Everything was connected, but she was still missing a piece of the puzzle. Whatever was happening in Blackshore, it was bigger than she had imagined, and it was coming for her. The voices faded, and Lisa allowed herself a moment of relief, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed answers, and she was running out of time. As she stepped out of the alley, the fog parted momentarily, revealing a figure standing at the end of the street. It was Caleb, his eyes fixed on her with a look of grim determination. He raised a hand, beckoning her to follow. Come, he said, his voice carrying on the wind. There's something you need to see. Lisa hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run. But she knew this might be her only chance to unravel the mystery of Blackshore. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, following Caleb into the swirling fog. The air grew colder, and the sound of the sea roared in her ears. She could feel the weight of the town's history pressing down. And on her, a suffocating presence that whispered secrets too terrible to comprehend. But she couldn't stop now. She had come too far to turn back. As they reached the edge of the cliffs, Caleb pointed out to the sea. Look, he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. Lisa followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. Emerging from the fog was the ghost ship, its tattered sails billowing in the wind. It was a sight both beautiful and terrifying, a specter from the past that carried with it the weight of countless lives lost to the sea. "It's come for you," Caleb whispered, "and it won't stop until it has what it wants." Lisa's heart raced as she stared at the ship, a sense of dread washing over her. She didn't know what awaited her on that vessel, but she knew one thing for certain. Her journey into the heart of Blackshore's mystery had only just begun. And the sea would not let her go. Chapter 13. Veils of Fog. The morning mist clung to Blackshore like a damp shroud, obscuring the jagged cliffs and turning the town into a ghostly silhouette. Lisa Monroe stood at the harbor's edge, her coat pulled tightly around her against the chill. The air smelled of salt and decay, a scent that seemed to seep into her very bones. She glanced down at the old journal in her hands, its pages yellowed and brittle. The journal detailed sightings of the ghost ship, and Lisa's heart raced with both fear and anticipation. She knew she was close to uncovering the truth, but the thought of what that truth might be terrified her. Inside the drunken sailor pub, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The jukebox played a mournful sea shanty, and the locals cast furtive glances in Lisa's direction as she entered. She made her way to the bar, where Caleb Hargrove sat, nursing a drink. His gnarled hands gripped the glass tightly, and his eyes, weathered by decades at sea, seemed to stare through her. "Mr. Hargrove," Lisa began, her voice trembling slightly, "I found this journal at the library. It talks about the ghost ship. Have you seen it?" Caleb didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Some come back, some don't. The sea takes and gives as it will." Lisa leaned in closer, her curiosity piqued. "But what does that mean? What happens to those who don't come back?" Caleb's eyes darkened, and he slammed his glass down on the bar. "You're asking questions you ain't ready to hear the answers to, girl. Leave it be." "But I need to know," Lisa insisted, her desperation seeping into her voice. "People are disappearing, and I think the ghost ship is connected to it." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, then stood up abruptly. "You think you're brave, digging into things you don't understand, but there's things out there. Things that'll drive you mad if you look too close. You best be careful." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lisa to ponder his cryptic warning. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but her determination only grew stronger. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. Later that evening, Lisa found herself alone on Ethan Graves' fishing boat, the Sea Witch. She had sneaked aboard after overhearing Ethan and Tommy Fallon discussing a secret meeting. The boat was anchored just beyond the harbor, its deck slick with seawater and reeking of fish. The fog was thicker here, wrapping around the boat like a suffocating blanket. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she crept below deck, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The hold was dark and damp, the air filled with the smell of salt and something else, something strange and unidentifiable. She found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, her hands trembling as she pried it open. Inside, she discovered a collection of strange symbols carved into the wood, along with a list of names. Some of the names she recognized, they were fishermen who had disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the significance of her discovery. The secret society of fishermen was real, and they were involved in the disappearances. Suddenly, she heard footsteps above her. She froze, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The footsteps grew louder, and then the hatch to the hold slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her as she realized she wasn't alone. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of something moving in the darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she turned it on. The beam of light revealed a figure standing at the far end of the hold. It was Ethan Graves, his face twisted with anger. "Thought you could sneak aboard my boat, did you?" he growled, stepping closer. "You're meddling in things you don't understand." Lisa backed away, her heart racing. "I just want to know the truth. Why are you doing this?" Ethan's eyes narrowed and he grabbed her arm roughly. The truth would drive you mad. You think you can handle it. Think again." He dragged her towards the hatch, his grip like a vice. Lisa struggled, but he was too strong. As they reached the deck, she caught a glimpse of something in the fog, a shadowy outline of a ship, its sails tattered and its hull ancient. The ghost ship. Ethan saw it too, and for a moment, his grip loosened. Lisa seized the opportunity and broke free, running to the edge of the boat. The fog was thick, visibility nearly non-existent. She could hear Ethan shouting behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Without thinking, she jumped overboard, the icy water closing in around her. The cold was like a knife, slicing through her skin and stealing her breath. She swam blindly, the fog pressing in on all sides. She could hear the sound of the ghost ship's sails flapping in the wind, but she couldn't see it. Her body grew numb, her movements sluggish. She wasn't sure how long she could keep going. Just as she thought she might give up, she felt something solid beneath her feet, the shore. She crawled onto the beach, gasping for air, her body shivering uncontrollably. The fog began to lift, and she saw the town of Blackshore in the distance. She had made it back, but at what cost? As she lay on the cold sand, the ghost ship fading into the mist, she knew she had crossed a line. The truth was out there, but it might just destroy her. Somewhere in the distance, a voice whispered, "Some come back, some don't. Do you really want to know why?" Lisa closed her eyes, tears mixing with the salt water on her face. She didn't have an answer, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop now. The sea had claimed too many already, and she wouldn't let it claim her too. Chapter 14. The Abyss Within. The fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the harbor whole. Lisa stood at the edge of the dock, her hands trembling as she clutched the old journal she'd found in the library. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough to send chills down her spine. The legend of the ghost ship was more than just a tale. It was a warning. She could feel the weight of the town's secrets pressing down on her, heavy and suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the distant cry of a gull sounded more like a wail. She glanced over her shoulder at the drunken sailor pub, its windows glowing faintly in the fog. The locals were gathered inside, their voices muffled but urgent. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. They knew she was getting too close. The journal in her hands was proof of that. The pub was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of stale beer and tobacco. The jukebox played a haunting sea shanty, the melody twisting and turning like the fog outside. Lisa slid into a booth near the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the journal and began to read, her eyes scanning the pages for any clue that might explain the disappearances. "She's got that look," a voice growled from the bar. Lisa glanced up to see Ethan Graves sitting at the counter, his back to her. His voice was low, but it carried across the room. "The same look they all get before they disappear." "Shut your mouth, Ethan," Tommy Fallon hissed, his voice trembling. He sat across from Ethan, his face pale and drawn. "You know what happens when you talk too much." Ethan slammed his glass down on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. "I'm tired of this. Tired of the lies, the secrets. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like everything's fine." "You think you're the only one who's scared," Tommy shot back, his voice rising. "You think I don't know what's out there, but talking about it won't help. It'll just make it worse." Lisa watched them carefully, her mind racing. She had to know more, she had to understand. She stood up and approached the bar, her hands trembling as she clutched the journal. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What's out there?" Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes cold and unflinching. "You're playing with fire, girl," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're clever, digging into things you don't understand, but you're just another fool who thinks she can outsmart the sea." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "I'm not a fool," she said, her voice steady. "I know something's wrong, I know people are disappearing, and I'm not going to stop until I find out why." Ethan laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You want to know why? Fine. The sea takes what it wants. It always has. And if you keep poking your nose where it doesn't belong, it'll take you too." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Is that what happened to Ethan Graves?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's face darkened, and for a moment Lisa thought he might lunge at her. But then he turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he muttered. "None of you do." Tommy grabbed Ethan's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, don't," he pleaded. "You know what happens when you talk." Ethan shook him off, his face grim. "I'm done pretending," he said, his voice hollow. "I'm done." He turned and walked out of the pub, the door slamming shut behind him. Lisa watched him go, her mind racing with questions. She had to find out more. She had to know the truth. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its beam cutting through the fog like a blade. Lisa made her way up the cliff path, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the sound of the sea. She could feel the weight of the ocean pressing down on her, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the surface. The lighthouse door creaked open as she pushed it, the sound echoing through the empty tower. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, the walls lined with old fishing gear and strange relics. Lisa's footsteps echoed on the stairs as she climbed to the top, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She reached the top and stepped out onto the platform, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The sea stretched out before her, endless and dark. She could feel the pull of the ocean, a siren's call she couldn't resist. She took a step closer to the edge, her heart pounding in her chest. "You shouldn't be here." The voice startled her, and she turned to see Caleb Hargrove standing in the doorway, his face grim. "This place isn't safe," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You need to leave, now." Lisa shook her head, her hands trembling. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "I have to know the truth. I have to know what's out there." Caleb stepped closer, his eyes dark and unreadable. "The truth is a dangerous thing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left buried." Lisa felt a surge of anger, and she took a step closer to him. "People are disappearing," she said, her voice rising. "People are dying, and you're just going to sit here and pretend like nothing's wrong." Caleb's face hardened, and for a moment Lisa thought he might strike her. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You think I don't care?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "You think I haven't tried to stop it, but the sea won't be denied." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. "Then help me," she said, her voice pleading. "Help me stop it." Caleb shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that made Lisa's heart ache. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice hollow. "The sea has already chosen its next victim." Before Lisa could respond, Caleb turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty tower. She watched him go, her mind racing with questions. She had to find out more. She had to know the truth. Lisa sat in her room at the Drunken Sailor pub, her mind swirling with thoughts and fears. The journal lay open on the table in front of her, its pages filled with cryptic notes and strange symbols. She had spent hours poring over it, trying to make sense of the clues, but the more she read, the more confused she became. She picked up her phone and dialed a number, her hands trembling. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. "Hello." "Doc," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice spoke again, calm and reassuring. "Take a deep breath, Lisa. Tell me what's going on." Lisa took a deep breath and began to explain, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of the past few days. She told him about the disappearances, the ghost ship, the strange behavior of the fishermen. She told him about the journal and the clues she had found. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Lisa," the voice said finally, "you need to be careful. This sounds dangerous." "I know," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "But I can't stop now. I have to know the truth." There was another pause, and then the voice spoke again, calm and steady. "Then I'll help you, but you need to promise me one thing." "Anything," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Promise me you'll stay safe," the voice said. "Promise me you'll be careful." Lisa nodded, even though she knew the voice couldn't see her. "I promise," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be careful." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with questions. She had to find out the truth. She had to know what was out there. But as she sat there, staring at the journal, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already in too deep. The sea had chosen its next victim. She had a sinking feeling it was her. Chapter 15. The Fog's Embrace. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing Blackshore whole. The lighthouse beams struggled to pierce the dense mist, casting faint, ghostly streaks across the town. The harbor was silent, save for the rhythmic lapping of waves against the black rocks. Lisa Monroe stood at the edge of the dock, her breath visible in the cold night air. She tightened her coat around her, the weight of her camera bag digging into her shoulder. The fog seemed alive, swirling and shifting with an almost deliberate intent. She could feel it pressing against her skin, damp and suffocating, as if it sought to seep into her very bones. The Drunken Sailor pub was her first stop. The dim glow of its windows cut through the fog like a beacon, though it offered little comfort. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and smoke. The jukebox played a haunting sea shanty, its melody blending with the murmurs of the fishermen gathered at the corner table. Lisa hesitated at the door, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on Tommy Fallon, who sat hunched over a pint, his red hair stark against the dim lighting. She approached him, her footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floor. "Tommy," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Lisa, what are you doing here?" "I need answers," she said, her voice steady despite the unease coiling in her stomach. "About the disappearances, about the sea." Tommy's grip tightened around his glass. "You should leave it alone. It's not worth digging into." "Why?" she pressed. "What are you all so afraid of?" He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the other fishermen. "There are things you don't understand. The sea, it's not just water, it's alive. It takes what it wants." Lisa leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And Ethan, what happened to him?" Tommy's face paled. "Ethan knew too much. He was asking questions just like you, and now he's gone. You don't want to end up like him." Before she could respond, the bartender slammed a glass on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. Tommy flinched, his eyes darting to the door. "I've said too much already. Just be careful, Lisa. The fog's not the only thing out there." Lisa left the pub, the fog closing in around her like a shroud. Her thoughts swirled as she made her way to Caleb Hargrove's cottage. The old fisherman was her last hope for answers. The cottage loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. The weeds in the yard swayed in the breeze, their rustling adding to the eerie stillness. She knocked on the door, the sound hollow and distant. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing Caleb's weathered face. His eyes, clouded and distant, fixed on her. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you," Lisa said. "About the sea, about the disappearances." Caleb studied her for a moment before stepping aside. The interior of the cottage was cluttered and dim, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Lisa followed him to the living room, where a cracked window overlooked the sea. The fog pressed against the glass, obscuring the view. "You've been asking questions," Caleb said, his voice low and gravelly. "Foolish girl, you don't know what you're dealing with." "Then tell me," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "What's happening here? Why do people disappear? Why do they come back different?" Caleb's gaze drifted to the window. "The sea, it's older than this town, older than time itself. It gives and takes as it wills. Some are chosen, others are not." "Chosen for what?" Lisa pressed. He turned to her, his eyes piercing. "To serve, to feed its hunger. Those who disappear, they are marked, and those who return, they are its vessels." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. "Its vessels? What does that mean?" Caleb's expression darkened. "You've seen them, the ones who come back, emaciated, empty. They carry its essence within them, whether they know it or not, and it's only a matter of time before it consumes them completely." She stared at him, her mind reeling. "And Ethan, is that what happened to him?" Caleb's gaze fell. "Ethan, he was different. He fought it, tried to uncover its secrets, but the sea doesn't tolerate defiance. Now he's lost to it. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Is there any way to stop it? Caleb shook his head slowly. Once it's marked you, there's no escape. You can only hope it doesn't take too much. Lisa left the cottage, the fog thicker than ever. The weight of Caleb's words pressed on her as she made her way to the cliffs of despair. The wind howled around her, carrying the cries of the lost. The cliff's edge loomed ahead, a jagged line against the dark sea. She approached cautiously, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below echoing in her ears. She pulled out her camera, the lens capturing the swirling mist and the endless expanse of water. The footage would be perfect, mysterious, haunting. But as she focused on the horizon, something shifted in the fog. A shape emerged, massive and shadowy. Her breath caught in her throat as the form became clearer. A ship, an ancient, ghostly vessel, crept through the mist, its tattered sails billowing in the wind. Lisa's hands trembled as she zoomed in, the camera capturing every detail. The ship's wooden hull was weathered and cracked, its decks empty. But as she watched, a figure appeared at the helm. It was too far to see clearly, but there was something familiar about it. The figure turned, its gaze meeting hers across the distance. A cold wave of dread washed over her. The ship began to fade, dissolving into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. Lisa lowered the camera, her heart racing. Was it real, or just a trick of the mind? She didn't have time to ponder as a voice broke through the silence. You shouldn't be here. She turned to see Ethan Graves standing a few feet away, his face pale and gaunt. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like a man who had been lost at sea for years. Ethan, she whispered, her voice shaking. Is it really you? He stepped closer, his eyes hollow and distant. You need to leave, Lisa, before it's too late. What happened to you? She asked, taking a step back. Where have you been? He shook his head slowly. There's no time to explain, just don't let it take you. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog. Lisa stood frozen, the weight of what she had just witnessed pressing down on her. The sea's whispers grew louder, filling the air with a haunting melody. She knew then that the truth was far darker than she had ever imagined, and the sea was watching. The fog clung to her as she made her way back to town, the events of the night replaying in her mind. She thought of Ethan's warning, Caleb's cryptic words, and the ghostly ship in the mist. The sea's curse was real, and it had marked her. She could feel it, a cold, creeping presence beneath her skin. As she reached the edge of town, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat at the anonymous message on the screen. Some come back, some don't. Do you really want to know why? Lisa stared at the words, the fog swirling around her like a living thing. The answer was out there, hidden in the depths of the sea, and she was running out of time to find it.